Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage with me, Mike Hutchinson. I'm a games designer, and him, Glenn Ford. He's also a games designer. We are going to have a conversation now about rules as written versus house rules in the games that we make and the games that we play. And we might also wander off in the direction of edge cases and how you go about addressing those kinds of edge cases with the community of players publicly. And there'll be a bit of lamenting later from Glenn about my terrible rules writing.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say terrible rules writing. I think part of the thing is, and we'll get into this maybe at the end if we've got time, is that it's been my job a lot of the time to engage with a lot of the forums because I lead a more time-rich lifestyle than Mike. Because I invested sensibly, and and so I end up on a certain number of forums. Also, Mike had two small sproglings prior to me, so he had less time on these things. And one thing that's been interesting for me is we had conversations in which I firmly fought a certain position and strenuously argued for it. And Mike made a decision because Mike has to make a decision because that's his job. And now I end up arguing Mike's position against my position. And that's just part of the process now. And that's I think, and I'd love to do at some later point a conversation about what it's like to collaborate and be a leader versus a follower on these sorts of things. But we'll get into that at some later point. So. Yes, rules as written versus house rules. So, I mean, for the unlikely person who isn't aware of what's meant by that, rules as written, or raw, as you'll often see it in all caps in forums, is a literal and direct interpretation of exactly what the minuscule meaning of the words within a rule are. And these are the sort of discussions that will come down to the difference between may and can and those sorts of things. And it's finding out exactly what the rule meant for you to do in that situation.
Well, not what it meant to do, but what it is legalistically instructing you to do.
Yes, and this is always the dividing line between that and maybe on the other end of the scale, something you might call a house rule, where somebody will say, okay, the rules as written say that this should happen, but clearly that isn't what should happen. Let's house rule it, and let's say that in this instance, when it occurs, that's what happens. And I'll tell you, and this will be a good one to come back on when we come to edge cases. But one that's sort of come up recently, it's an interesting one on the Gaslands forums, is when people hit dropped weapons with templates that are interrupted by a collision.
Yeah.
Are we gonna step away from that one?
No, it's fine. Let's not have a discussion about it. No.
So there's the point where rules as written say something odd happens. Everybody will end up saying something sensible happens. And I suppose, okay. So part of this conversation is how do you, as the games designer, feel about your ownership of the rules in those situations versus where they begin to belong to the community?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the line is really clear for me, which is, I think, coming from a place where I have always joyously altered games willy-nilly. I remember when Necromunda was re-released by Games Workshop recently. I sort of played a game of it, and there was this rule called pinning, where if you're shot, you kind of have to hunker down, and then you need to roll the dice to start moving again. And I played a ton of Necromunda when I was a kid, and I had never encountered this rule before. And John, the other core developer on Gaslands, pointed out that yes, that's because when we got the copy of Necromunda, I flipped through the rules and went, pinned? What's this rubbish? We're never playing that. And we just never did play pin. So like, therein is an interesting situation where by ignoring a rule without knowing what the purpose of that rule was, I inadvertently changed the meaning of that game
Mm.
quite significantly without ever realizing it. Because when I returned to Necromunda, I realized that it was a much more cover hugging sort of push me pull me kind of a tense snipery experience than I remembered it, because when I played it we were just playing paintball and everyone was just running around like hooting, and it didn't matter whether there were any guns firing because they were obviously just filled with fruit juice or something. And so one of the things that I think is important about this rules as written versus house rules discussion, and it's something that I encounter quite often, is when someone first encounters the game and finds a piece of the rules as written and goes, blah, I don't like this at all. I don't know what it is or why it's here, but I'm going to take against it and change it immediately. For example, some people will often do this with Gasland says you can shoot once per gear phase if you activate, and people look at that and go, well, that's bonkers, that's clearly rubbish, I'm just going to immediately house rule that so you can only shoot once per round regardless of how many times you activate. And that is fine, and people are completely fine to do that. But in the same way that I essentially spoilt or completely changed my experience of Necromunda when I first played it, I think you run the risk when you house rule a game that you don't yet understand, that you break the designer's intention of what the game is supposed to be on the table, and you'll never know. And you might then go, and as a rules designer, what's troublesome is that you might have a bad experience with the game, because I know if you take that cog out, the hands spin the wrong way, and you go, this game is rubbish, the hands spin the wrong way, and you're like, well, you didn't play the game that I'd given you. You played a Frankenstein version that you deliberately broke one of the pieces off of. So there's a real tension as a games designer, because obviously your table, your rules, and I put that in pretty much all of my my manuscripts, that it is important that it's your table and your rules. But I also, in A Billion Suns, put in the bit where it describes that you play across multiple tables, I literally say, this might seem a bit weird, but don't house rule it out until you've played it, because it's really cool. But people will look at it and go, well, I don't have two tables, I'm just going to house rule that and throw that part of the game away. And they will lose a whole chunk of joy by doing that. And it's not what I intend for the game to behave like. So I think there's a real tension there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing where there's a line between when you house rule a decision that's been made because of an edge case, and when you house rule because you want an extra bit of creativity or an extra bit of something in your game. I mean, like an example where, you know, a lot of people have been sort of fiddling with the house rules on Gaslands, I found, around the ramps in Gaslands. And that's where people want more madness on the ramps, and want ramps that can give them a corkscrew or a loop the loop, or they want to be able to go sideways off the ramp, and
that's absolutely wonderful and perfect. And I think that where a house rule is additive, or it's saying, I understand how this works and I just want it to be more explodey or more corkscrewy, I think that's fantastic. And the other thing is that, and this is maybe slightly going off into what is a good house rule, but maybe that's the point. A good house rule for me is something that affects all the players. So house ruling a ramp or a piece of terrain to be more exciting and more explodey is great, because now you, at the beginning of the game, you all know that that's a thing, and then you can go and interact with that thing or not interact with that thing, versus say a house rule where I say, the team that I play, Slime, now has 25 cans more stuff than you. That's my house rule. Slime's better. Like, that's a ludicrous example, but there are plenty of examples of people's house rules where that is essentially what they're doing, is just biasing, throwing the game one way or t'other.
Yeah, and again, I think the ramp's a great example, because there are people house running ramps to just make ramps more sort of chaotic and fun. Because, I mean, you know, I love ramps. They're a quite short entry in Gaslands Refueled, which, you know, which works great. But it is kind of it's almost like a little, ooh, look, ooh, you could do that. And if you then choose to build yourself a corkscrew ramp and write rules for it, you're going to have a cracking time. And this is almost us saying, okay, look, there's a little road to follow down there. We're not going to. We could write 5 pages of ramp rules, and, you know, there'll be a certain people who would love that.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that the presence of ramp rules is itself an anomaly. Like, the game doesn't need the ramp rules. They're cool and they've been asked for, but the game doesn't really need them. But once they're there, they're sort of, there's a door ajar that you can shove on. which I think you're right. Like that's almost a rules as written, which is pushing the door open to say, hey, you know what's fine is inventing more chaos like this.
Whereas what's also interesting about the house about the ramps is that ramps plus harpoons does equal edge cases. And this is one of those things where it's like, okay, this is an edge case, and it's insanely hard to know this until you're very familiar with the game, is that there's a difference between a thing that happens because it's an edge case, because this is an incredibly rare interaction, and the thing that comes out at the end of it is going to happen one time in a million, and honestly it's just going to break everybody's brains if we correct the whole game in order to fix that thing. Versus this is an edge case which we intended for it to be this way, and it really needs to be this way, and fiddling with this is gonna crack things. I suppose it's where you choose to lay in your house rule, and understanding what are anchor rules and what are peripheral ones.
One of the things that this is a slight personal frustration. One of the things that comes out in one of these edge case discussions when you're trying to figure out how the game goes is that people will ask me, and Glenn will ask me, well, what do you intend to happen? What's the intention of the game when someone gets harpooned and drawn into the ramp? And of course, the answer with one of these excruciatingly edgy edge cases is, I've no idea. It never even occurred to me that this was an interaction that was going to occur. The most important thing for me is that this resolve itself in a way that doesn't damage the superstructure of the rules. And if that means that it sort of clips through the terrain and it does something slightly weird, like I'm fine with that, because the 99% of the game has been preserved in its simplicity. And this weird interaction that is a weird interaction is just a bug in the game. And like you can't get rid of all the bugs, so you just have to live with some of them.
Yeah, and there's a huge difference between a weird thing that happens occasionally and a place where the game breaks. And there have been there were points early on in the design where Gaslands had bits where it did break, and we fixed those, and I'm pretty confident there aren't any at this point. There are still points.
Let's just catch on that, because sometimes house rules exist because people think that the game has been broken or something breaks the game. Do you want to just describe what we mean by broken in this case?
Okay, I mean, so to my mind, there are two sorts of broken. I would argue in game design. There is what I would call the literal sort of broken, where the rules say do X, then do Y. You do X, and X says if A then B, and A and not B, and then you just go and the clock.
That's what I call blue screening. So that's when the game blue screens, where you follow the logical instructions of the game, and you reach a point where you cannot follow the logical instructions of the game because they are contradictory.
You have a literal game rule paradox, or a ... or you come to a point where you go, okay, I followed that step, I followed that step, I followed that step, and then what do I do? And I don't have an answer for that. And those are the situations where I think a game literally breaks.
And I think at the table, I think those are quite stressful and upsetting in a very minor first world problems kind of a way. Like that is a situation that you are in good faith trying to play a game that you are up until that point enjoying, and then the road just runs out and you're like, blue screen, restart.
Yes. I think the more common version of broken that gets used a lot is synonymous to overpowered. And there are occasional instances where something is literally brokenly overpowered. Like a great example in Gaslands is that there's a return fire perk in one of the military systems, where if you get shot, you then can fire your gun. Very early version, that wasn't limited to once per phase, so it meant you activated one of your dudes, he fired, and then one of the crew members fired a pistol at your guy with return fire, who got a turn of shooting, then fired his pistol at the other guy with return fire, and then you got infinity shooting. And that's a literally broken piece of overpowering.
I think that maybe wanders back into the blue screen area. Because essentially you end up with an infinite loop, which is a kind of bug. I think, that meaning of, because I think there's a third meaning of broken, actually. So that the meaning of broken that you refer to is something is so horribly powerful that it reduces the obvious choices, because the obvious choice is this thing that's just ridiculously outside of the power curve, and that then is a broken choice because essentially because the decision making is broken.
Yeah.
And I suppose another way of saying that, which maybe isn't a third description of it, or a third meaning for broken, but another way that the game can be broken is maybe better described as solved. So if you provide a set of options, and having played the game a couple of times, a particular strategy becomes obviously the best, and this can happen in board games as well, like that board game or that skirmish game is broken because there's no longer a set of decision making that's worth having. It is solved.
Yeah, I mean,
and I worry a lot about games being solved, because particularly when you're selling just a rule book and that's all you've got, like this thing needs to have longevity, and longevity comes from the game not being solved, the meta not being
sure
solved.
Tic-tac-toe is solved. I don't think I'd say it was broke, because it works just fine. It's just not great.
Yeah, but people don't enjoy playing it and choose to play it with their friends.
No, I agree.
I would say in that regard, it's, there's a moment in every tic-tac-toe game that it becomes solved, and it just happens after about 3 moves.
Yeah, totally. And so sort of looping back, I suppose, is there were points, and there are points in every game where the game is literally broken. I'm fairly firmly of the opinion that most, if not all, commercially available games are not literally fairly definable as broken. There are some incredibly rare exceptions, but nothing like as often as you might hear that term employed to describe them. And I think it's much more often that the term broken is used to say, I don't like this, or this is just a sort of, I'm unhappy about it.
I didn't enjoy this experience because I was expecting something other to happen than what in fact happened.
Yeah, and I suppose the point is that, I guess, if you want to house rule one of the sort of endpoint rules, where there's a thing that spits out and you're not totally jolly about how it spat out, and you just want to tack onto it a rule that says, if this happens, do this instead. That's probably fine, because you've probably found an edge case that that was important to leave in. If you look at the core rules and you just go, I don't think that works the way it should work, then I would implore you to trust us. We probably looked at it, and we probably tried
half
a few
of the
versions.
game design community. We probably play tested it.
I mean, it's one of the things I will say is that if you're enjoying a game, you should be trusting that designer. They've put something together that you like, and I would suggest giving them a few cracks to the whip before you decide that something needs tweaking and house ruling.
Yeah, and that's because particularly miniature game rule systems, are quite fragile beasts that take a lot of tinkering to get the sort of crazy machinery to function. And when you pull a cog out, you won't necessarily understand why that cog was put in. And very few cogs are just left in. Well, particularly in the way that I design games, very few cogs are left in that are serving no purpose, because I very, very, very much want to remove all of the rules, because I hate reading rule books. So I don't want people to read a longer rule book than needs to be. That's a particular, just sort of wander off in a different direction, particular piece of advice I like to give is, if you are thinking of house ruling a game, focus on the sort of play mode, like the scenario or the mission, rather than the actual core engine. Because I suppose coming back into games design 7 or 8 years ago, like a lot of my time was spent creating alternative play modes for game systems that I was already enjoying. And that, I think, is a wonderful place where you can design around the edges of a system, and you can watch it wobble off in a direction and see where it falls over, without necessarily pulling something valuable out of the heart of it.
Absolutely. I mean, if I, if I ever have any sort of starting advice for designing this sort of game, is take a system that you enjoy and that you're familiar with, then write an additional weapon, scenario, vehicle, wherever it happens to be, that one of your friends wants to play, and that you're okay playing with them. And that if you can do that, that's because it's very easy to write a force or a unit that you're happy to use, and none of your friends are happy to play against you.
Yeah.
It's very easy to write something that you're happy to play against and nobody wants to touch with a barge pole. If you can write something that it fits into your friend's list or army or whatever it is, such that he really wants it, and that you're happy to face it on the battlefield, I think that teaches you a lot about writing those parts of a game, and will let you see a lot about how maybe some of the mechanics of that game probably work. A quick, I suppose, this is something I you probably know a lot more about me in this respect, is when you decide to leave an edge case in, as opposed to when you because I know that you we've consciously come to points in games and we've gone, yes, there is an edge case there where something weird happens, and I know that you've been aware of them, and you've made the executive decision to go, you know what, making everybody else learn the rule that will fix this edge case is too much a punishment for everybody else to be a reward for the person who ends up in the edge case.
Yeah, it's a really tricky call, because quite often you've got something, and this tends to happen with exciting exotic weaponry. Something where you want to place a little bit of additional rules that say, hey, when you fire this like catapult that fires chickens, like there's a squawking noise and that triggers some kind of game effect because the theme is fun. And when you've got something like that, which people are not going to take that often, what you want is for it to be like one line that says, gun that fires chickens, people get distracted, it's amazing. And if you then have to put a huge sort of 8-line paragraph of legalese underneath, which says, of course, in the instance where the chicken hits a brick wall first, then it dies before it makes it squawk and you don't have the thing. But if it's like passes over another vehicle, then that vehicle also hears the chicken squawk, and therefore that, both the target and the intervening vehicle suffer the effects of the chicken. And like, ultimately that just sucks fun out of the initial experience of reading that rule. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that FAQ documents I like FAQ documents, and I've had this really interesting experience when Gaslands Refueled came out, because Gaslands Refueled came out, and on the same day I published the first FAQ document, and somebody left this really snotty message that was like, oh really, like they spent all that time rewriting the game for Gaslands Refueled and it still had to have an FAQ on the day of release. And that kind of hurt, because the point is, the FAQ is for you, the person who cares about the chicken squawking edge case. It's not for the person who wants to open the game on Christmas morning and go, great, a car racing game, I really want to play that. Like the user experience, the player experience of reading the rules should be one of inspiring you to play a joyful game of miniature combat. Where you bury the legalese edge case capture is a really fine decision, and it's based entirely on how you want the player to experience the game, both first and then later down the line when you've built their trust and their engagement. And so placing rules exceptions and lawyering quite early in the core rules is dangerous, because for me that's a place where you need to really be rushing them through to the table to get the experience. Placing rules exceptions and extensions in deeper, more advanced rules like the faction rules and like the special weapons rules, like that's okay, because you have to dig down, you have to understand the game to be able to dig down to that point, and you're going to be more tolerant of exceptions and waving tentacles of rules. But I still think that there's a perfectly legitimate place to take all that and just say, put it in an FAQ document, which is for those people who care enough to bother to find this edge case and then be cross about the fact that it isn't resolved, and then go and look for an FAQ and find, oh, they have actually resolved this. That's rather nice. I think I'm one of the things that I read and reread in attempting to reach the Billion Suns manuscript was I read and reread the rule book for the starter box, the original starter box for X-Wing.
All right.
A magnificently terse piece of writing. There was almost no words in that initial rule book. And the problem is that when you're a game nut like us, you try and put X-Wing on the table and you go, but what happens? What is all this? And where does this go? And actually, it's really intriguing because I looked at that for a long time trying to figure out whether that was the way to do things, which is actually to say, this is how the game roughly works. All of this stuff about edge cases, we'll just figure that out together, and we'll maybe put that in an FAQ or an extension thing. And there's a really difficult balance to strike between joyful first experience and, you know, having a frustrating edge case experience. So that's why it's an imperfect science.
Yeah, and I think there are a finite number of pages that can be put into any given book, and a finite number of words, and I think also
there's also a finite tolerance of the reader.
Oh yeah. No, I totally agree with that. Yeah, no, I agree. I think that is the first, that is the first point to it. But there are a range of limits there, and I think one of the things is sometimes when you're as intimate with a game as we were with Gaslands, the first time a set of rules come up, the first time a given rule comes up, like 20 or 30 seconds later, I go, oh, just a minute. When this combines with that, and that combines with that, and that combines with that, that results in this weird situation. It doesn't break the game, but it's weird. And then
it flips a car infinitely into the sky, like
and then like
hit by a giant in Skyrim.
And then you put it out, and then like 2 years later, of the however many thousand people playing it, somebody finds that edge case, and you go, yeah, it's weird. We're aware that it's weird. It's not going to break the game. And you go, yeah, it probably wasn't worth the extra paragraph, despite the fact it was glaringly obvious, at the time. These things don't always get found by people, even when there's a lot of monkeys and a lot of typewriters.
Yeah. And so I think that's the crucial thing, is that the player experience, the majority player experience has to trump the minority deeper edge case player. Yeah. Because by doing that you hit more players, and therefore you create more of these deeper engaged players, and the goal, the thing that I'm trying to do is to get them trusting me to the point where, having reached that deep level of the game where they have discovered the secret chamber of edge cases, that they are, they're comfortable enough with the game. They trust that these edge cases are not through negligence, and they just, they come and they figure out, they come to Board Game Geek to ask about how to figure them out, or they are happy if the answer is there isn't a clean answer here, because we'd have to have rewritten Final Position to make it even more horrible than it is.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think so far, and knock on wood, there's a low enough number of those situations that we are personally, case by case, able to go in and go, it's fine. It is an edge case. You have our blessing to break the rules on that. Yeah. I will personally come and lay hand. Well, I mean, at the moment, not literally, but I will personally, on a forum, lay hands on each of those edge cases and go, yeah, we know it's okay. Don't worry. Feel free to tweak it there.
Great. Well, I think that's probably all to say about rules of written versus house rules.
Yep, certainly for now. So yeah, it's been fantastic. Again, whether you're watching this on YouTube or you're listening to it as a podcast, there should be a comment section nearby. We'd love to hear from you if you've got any questions on house rules, on edge cases, on catch-all rules that we were talking about earlier.
No questions about drop weapons, please.
Definitely no weapons about drop weapon. Questions about drop weapons. They're a class unto themselves. Leave a comment wherever you see this. Reach out to us. I'm on Instagram as Mannequin Games. I'm on Twitter as Mannequin Games #1. Mike is on Twitter as Crikey Miles. We have websites that will be listed wherever this is being posted.
Yeah,
we'd love to hear from you. And yeah, until next time, when we figure out something else to ramble on about. Thank you very much, and we'll see you later.
Bye.
Bye.